In the late autumn of 1911, as the Appalachian ridges burned with the fleeting fire of crimson and gold, Sheriff Brody Hayes rode his aging mare up the winding, nearly invisible trail to Thorn Hollow. For 2 days, no smoke had risen from the chimney of the Thorn cabin, and in a community bound by the silent language of wood smoke and lamplight, such an absence was a scream. He found the cabin door slightly ajar, swinging on a single leather hinge, creaking a mournful rhythm in the biting wind. The air inside was colder than the air outside, thick with a silence that felt heavier than sound. The meager contents of the one-room dwelling were undisturbed. A half-eaten loaf of cornbread sat on the table, a petrified testament to an interrupted life. But it was the thing on the floor that made the sheriff, a man hardened by the mountain's casual cruelties, take a staggered step back. In the center of the rough-hewn floorboards, directly in the pale light filtering from the single window, was a stain. It was not a spill, nor a patch of rot. It was a shadow, a perfect, child-sized silhouette, arms slightly outstretched, as if in a moment of surprise. It was impossibly dark, a void in the grain of the wood, and it possessed a terrifying permanence. It was as if a child had been standing there when the sun became a branding iron, scorching their absence into the very substance of the world. Of the twin girls who lived there, Alara and Lyra Thorne, there was no sign, not a footprint, not a dropped doll, not a single thread from their simple dresses. There was only this impossible shadow and the profound, echoing silence. The official report filed by Sheriff Hayes would become the bedrock of the accepted story, a tragic but unremarkable tale for its time and place. The Thorne twins, it was concluded, were likely taken, snatched by vagrants passing through the mountains, or perhaps dragged away by a bear or a panther. It was a story the community could understand, a sorrow they could process. The mountains were vast, and they had a hungry, indiscriminate appetite. The case was closed, filed away in a dusty cabinet in the county courthouse, another small flame of life extinguished by the unforgiving wilderness. But this official history was a lie, a carefully constructed falsehood designed to bury a truth far more disturbing than any animal attack. The real story was not one of kidnapping, but of a chilling ritual. It was a tale of fear, fanaticism, and a crime so unnatural it tore a wound in the fabric of reality, leaving behind a vengeful echo etched in wood. The truth was not lost in the wilderness. It was deliberately buried in sealed archives, a secret sealed by shame and terror. Every town, every hollow, has a story that the official histories try to forget. We unearth them. If you believe these truths need to be told, subscribe to our archive and activate the bell so you are notified of every new discovery. Let us know in the comments what state or country you represent, and become part of our global search for buried history. To understand the events that transpired in that isolated cabin, one must first understand the world that enclosed it. The Appalachian Mountains of 1911 were a world unto themselves, a rugged and deeply insular society where folklore held as much sway as fact, and the Word of God was often filtered through the dark lens of superstition. Life was a relentless cycle of hardship, governed by the seasons and the unforgiving topography. Here, in a small, forgotten valley known as Thorn Hollow, Jebediah and Martha Thorne scratched a meager existence from the rocky soil. Jebediah was a man carved from the mountains themselves, hard, silent, and weathered beyond his years. Martha was his opposite in temperament, but his equal in resilience, a woman whose quiet strength was the mortar holding their life together. Their love was not one of soft words or gentle gestures. It was a practical, durable bond forged in the crucible of shared struggle. And at the center of their world were their daughters, Alara and Lyra. They were born on a night of a furious storm, identical in every conceivable way. They had the same pale, corn-silk hair, the same startlingly blue eyes, and the same quiet, watchful disposition. As they grew from infants to toddlers, their sameness became more than just physical. It was profound, almost unnerving. They moved in a strange, unconscious synchrony, their gestures and expressions mirroring one another perfectly. One would begin a sentence, and the other would finish it, not as an interruption, but as a seamless continuation of a single thought. When Alara scraped her knee on the hearthstone, it was Lyra who would cry out in pain, clutching her own unblemished leg. Martha once watched, her heart a cold stone in her chest, as Lyra, sitting inside the dim cabin, suddenly squinted and shielded her eyes at the exact moment Alara, playing outside, glanced up into the blinding midday sun. They were two bodies, but it was becoming terrifyingly clear to their parents that they possessed only one soul. This strange union was a source of both deep love and profound, gnawing fear for Jebediah and Martha. They cherished their daughters with a fierce protective instinct. They saw their shared laughter, their secret, silent games, their absolute devotion to one another. But in the quiet hours of the night, in the flickering lamplight that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, they would whisper their anxieties. This was not natural. It was not of God. Neighbors, the few who lived within a day's walk, spoke of the Thorn twins in hushed, wary tones. They were called fetch children, or the one-soul girls. The parents saw the sideways glances, the way other children were pulled away when Alara and Lyra approached. Their daughter's otherworldly connection was isolating the family, branding them as outsiders in a community that already lived on the fringe of the world. The most disturbing manifestation of their bond, however, was the shadow. It was a simple, physical impossibility that defied all logic and reason, a daily violation of the laws of nature. The girls did not each have their own shadow. Together, they cast only one. It was a single, crisp silhouette that was tethered not to an individual, but to their shared existence. If the girls stood side by side in the sun, one shadow would lie on the ground behind them. If they stood apart, the shadow would anchor itself to whichever girl was in the strongest light. It would leap instantaneously and without a blur from Alara's feet to Lyra's as they moved in and out of the sun's rays, a dark, fleeting tether that bound them together. Jebediah first noticed it when they were 3, and for years he tried to reason it away as a trick of the light, a quirk of the hills and the trees. But its persistence was undeniable. He would test it, asking one girl to stand by the sunlit window while the other remained in the cabin's dark corner. The shadow would lay starkly on the floor at the feet of the girl in the light. Then he would ask them to switch places, and he would watch, his blood running cold, as the shadow vanished from one spot and reappeared in the other in the blink of an eye. It was their deepest and most terrifying secret. To their parents, this singular shadow was not a curiosity. It was proof. It was the physical mark of their daughter's unnatural union, a dark emblem of something they could neither understand nor control. It was a constant, silent accusation that the children they loved were fundamentally wrong, an affront to the natural order. And as their fear grew, it hollowed them out, creating a space for a far greater darkness to enter their lives. They were becoming desperate for an explanation, for salvation, for anyone who could promise to make their children whole, even if it meant tearing them apart. Into this sealed world of fear and secrecy, the serpent arrived. He came not on horseback, but on foot, a tall, gaunt figure in a dust-caked black coat, his face a sharp geography of bone and shadow. He called himself the Reverend Silas Blackwood, an itinerant preacher whose parish was the entire untamed spine of the Appalachian Range. He carried with him only a worn, leather-bound Bible and a reputation that traveled ahead of him like a storm front. In the scattered, God-fearing settlements, they said Blackwood had a gift for finding the spiritual rot that festered in the dark corners of men's souls. They said his eyes, the color of a winter sky, could see the hairline fractures in a person's faith. He was not a preacher of comfort or gentle forgiveness. He was a physician of the spirit whose diagnosis was always sickness, and whose only prescription was fire and fear. He believed the wilderness was not God's empty cathedral, but the devil's unkempt garden, and it was his personal crusade to root out every noxious weed he could find. His arrival in the cluster of homesteads nearest to Thorn Hollow was, by his own design, an event. His voice, when he spoke from a makeshift pulpit of stacked crates, was not the thunderous roar of a revivalist, but something far more unsettling. It was a low, resonant baritone, each word polished and deliberate, like stones worn smooth by a dark, fast-moving river. He spoke of the subtle snares of the enemy, of the deceiver who could wear the face of an innocent, of abominations that could take root in a family's own bloodline. He was a master of sowing unease, of turning a community's vague, superstitious anxieties into a palpable named terror. It was inevitable, then, that the whispers about the Thorn twins would find their way to his ears. The stories of the one-soul girls, garbled and embellished in the telling, were exactly the kind of spiritual contagion he sought. He listened patiently as a farmer's wife spoke of their silent, mirrored movements, of the unsettling emptiness in their identical blue eyes. His expression remained one of solemn interest, but behind the mask of piety, a cold, predatory excitement was kindled. This was no common tale of a cursed well or a haunted wood. This was something novel, something profound, a challenge. Under the guise of a pastoral visit to a family that had not been seen at a gathering in years, Reverend Blackwood made the journey to Thorn Hollow. He found Jebediah splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, the only sound breaking the silence. Jebediah was wary, his hand tightening on the axe handle as the preacher approached. Martha watched from the doorway, a pale, anxious figure clutching a dishcloth. Blackwood disarmed them with a practiced ease, his voice a balm of gentle concern. He spoke of the burdens of isolation, of the comfort of faith in trying times. He did not ask about the children directly. He was patient. He sat with them at their rough-hewn table, accepting a cup of water, his gaze sweeping the small cabin, absorbing every detail, searching for the crack in the foundation of their lives. And then he saw them. Ilara and Lyra were sitting on the floor near the hearth, playing a silent game with small, smooth stones. To a stranger, they were simply two beautiful, identical children. But Blackwood saw more. He saw the unnatural stillness, the way their heads tilted at the exact same angle, the way their small hands moved in perfect, unnerving synchrony. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This was not the simple mimicry of twins. This was a performance without a conductor, a dance without a choreographer. It was a single intelligence animating two separate vessels. He continued his placid conversation with Martha and Jebediah, but his true attention was fixed on the girls, his mind already sifting through the darkest passages of Scripture, searching for a name for what he was witnessing. The confirmation he sought came as the afternoon sun began to dip below the ridge, casting a long, slanted beam of light through the cabin's single window. Ilara, closest to the door, was bathed in the warm golden light, and a crisp, dark shadow stretched out behind her on the floorboards. Lyra sat a few feet away, in the cabin's growing gloom, and cast no shadow at all. Blackwood felt his heart quicken. "A beautiful afternoon," he murmured to Martha, his eyes never leaving the children. "Such a blessing, the Lord's light." He then turned his attention to the girls. With a voice that was both gentle and commanding, he said, "Lyra, my child, come stand by your sister in the sun." Lyra obeyed without question, rising and walking into the beam of light to stand beside Ilara. Jebediah drew a sharp, involuntary breath. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, for as Lyra stepped into the light and Ilara stepped out of it, the shadow on the floor did not duplicate, nor did it shift. It leaped. In an instant, it vanished from behind Ilara and reappeared perfectly formed at Lyra's feet. It was a transfer as clean and absolute as flipping a switch. Blackwood stared, his mask of pastoral calm finally cracking, replaced by a look of terrible, triumphant vindication. He had seen it, the physical proof. He slowly rose to his feet, his towering frame casting the parents into his own considerable shadow. "Lord, have mercy," he whispered, but it was not a plea, it was a declaration. In that moment, he was no longer a visitor. He was an authority. He saw the raw, naked terror in the parents' eyes, the fear they had lived with for years, now laid bare by his presence. This was the opening he needed. Over the next several days, Reverend Blackwood began his methodical work. He did not condemn them. He commiserated. He sat with Jebediah and Martha late into the night, the cabin lit by a single flickering lantern, and he listened. He drew their secret out of them, not with force, but with a feigned empathy that was more effective than any threat. He nodded gravely as they spoke of the shared pain, the mirrored thoughts, the impossible leaping shadow. He made them feel understood for the first time in their lives. He validated their deepest, most unspeakable fear, that their children were not a blessing, but a curse. "You have carried a great and terrible burden," he told them, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "You have lived in the presence of an unholy union, and your faith has not broken. You are stronger than you know." Once he had earned their trust, he began to redefine their reality. He opened his Bible, its pages thin and soft from use, and he began to weave a new story for them. He did not read the comforting verses of the Psalms or the hopeful parables of the Gospels. He took them to the dark, forgotten corners of the Old Testament, to the obscure laws of Leviticus and the terrifying prophecies of Revelation. He spoke of spiritual parasites, of demonic entities that could cleave to a bloodline, of a singular soul of a beast that, in a blasphemous mockery of the Holy Trinity, could inhabit more than one vessel of flesh. "You must understand," he explained, his finger tracing a grim verse. "You do not have two daughters. You have one entity, one consciousness, wearing the bodies of your children like a garment." He gave their terror a name. He called the presence within their children the Union, a singular demon that had fused their souls at birth. The girls, he insisted, the real Alara and Lyra, were prisoners within their own bodies, their individual spirits suppressed and slowly being digested by the entity that controlled them. The shared shadow, he proclaimed, was the proof. It was the demon's own shadow, a tether to its foul essence, a visible chain linking the two physical forms to a single, damned spirit. "Each time it leaps," he said, his eyes burning with conviction, "it is the beast reminding you that these bodies belong to it. It is a mark of its absolute ownership." He forbade them from speaking of it to anyone else. "The Union feeds on notice, he warned. To speak its nature to the unconsecrated is to give it power, to allow its influence to spread like a plague." He isolated them completely, making himself the sole arbiter of their reality, the only source of information and hope. The Thorn Cabin, already a world apart, became a hermetically sealed chamber of escalating dread, with Blackwood's voice as the only air to breathe. He prayed with them, his prayers becoming longer and more fervent, describing in horrifying detail the damnation that awaited the entity that possessed their children. He made them fast, telling them that to purify their own bodies was to weaken the demon's hold on their home. Hunger and exhaustion began to erode their judgment, their resistance. Jebediah, a practical man who had always trusted the evidence of his own hands, found his certainty crumbling. Blackwood's words were like water on stone, a slow, patient erosion of everything he thought he knew. The preacher's explanation, as terrifying as it was, made a horrible kind of sense. It explained the synchronicity, the shared thoughts, the shadow. It took the chaotic, frightening mystery of his daughters and gave it a structure, a narrative he could comprehend, even if that narrative was one of pure evil. Martha, already weakened by years of anxiety and social ostracization, clung to the preacher's words as a drowning woman clings to a rock. The idea that her true daughters were trapped inside, waiting to be freed, was a sliver of hope she could not bear to relinquish. The love for their children became twisted into a desperate need to save them from the thing they had become. The Reverend did not have to convince them to hate their daughters. He had only to convince them that the girls they saw were no longer their daughters at all. He was offering them a divine justification, a holy permission slip to do the unthinkable, framing an act of horrific violence not as a murder, but as a righteous, necessary exorcism. The poison had taken root. In the crucible of the Thorn Cabin, under the relentless pressure of Reverend Blackwood's certainty, Jebediah and Martha's fear finally calcified into a terrible, misshapen resolve. The preacher, sensing their defenses had been ground to dust, ceased his work of diagnosis and began the chilling work of prescription. He gathered them close one evening, the last light of a weary sun bleeding away behind the peaks, and he outlined the final, necessary act. He called it the ritual of separation, a name that was both clinical and holy, suggesting a divine surgery of the soul. He spoke of it not as an act of violence, but as an act of profound, agonizing mercy, a spiritual amputation to save the life of the host. The union, he explained, his voice a low, hypnotic thrum, has woven itself into the very fabric of their being. It cannot be coaxed out with prayer alone. It must be excised. We must create a spiritual crisis, a moment of such profound imbalance that the entity is forced to reveal its true form. We will sever the unnatural tether that binds these two bodies to its singular will, and in doing so, we will release the captive souls of your true daughters. He presented the procedure not as a choice, but as a dire and holy necessity, their last and only chance to reclaim the children the devil had stolen from them. He laid out the components of the ritual, each one steeped in a dark, invented symbolism that preyed on their deep-seated folklore. They would need 2 mirrors, silvered with mercury, which he called soul forges, capable of capturing a true reflection and repelling a false one. They would need a circle of consecrated salt, the crystalline earth, to create a vessel from which the demon could not escape. They would need candles of pure tallow to represent the light of holy truth, and a length of rope braided from the hair of a horse, a worldly tether that would be symbolically cut to sever the spiritual one. Jebediah listened, his face an unreadable mask of granite, but his hands, resting on the rough wood of the table, were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white as bone. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with an axe or a plow. The abstract nature of the spiritual battle had left him feeling powerless, and Blackwood was finally offering him a task, a physical role to play in the salvation of his family. The logic, twisted as it was, appealed to his desperate need to do something. Martha, however, wept. She wept silently, tears tracing clean paths through the grime of exhaustion on her cheeks. They were tears not of grief for what she was about to do, but of a terrible, fragile hope for the children she believed she would get back. The preacher had given her a vision of Alara and Lyra, whole and separate, their souls their own, and this vision was a light so bright it blinded her to the darkness of the path required to reach it. "When must it be done?" Jebediah asked, his voice rough. "On the night of the new moon," Blackwood answered, without hesitation. "When the sky is at its blackest, and the veil between the worlds is at its thinnest, the creature will be at its most vulnerable then, its power not fed by the reflected light of the sun. We have 3 days to prepare, to purify this house and fortify your spirits." The next 3 days passed in a haze of grim preparation. Blackwood had them scrub the cabin's floorboards with brine and wormwood until the raw wood was pale. He made them board up the single window, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight, claiming that the demon must not be allowed to gaze upon the outside world it sought to corrupt. Jebediah and Martha moved like automatons, their exhaustion a thick blanket muffling the screams of their own fracturing consciences. They avoided looking at their daughters, who seemed oblivious to the grim atmosphere. Alara and Lyra played their silent games, their movement still a perfect, fluid mirror of one another, their shared gaze following their parents with an unnerving placidity. To the terrified parents, this unnatural calm was the final proof they needed. Their real children would have been afraid. Their real children would have been crying. This serene, watchful entity was something else entirely. It was waiting. It was unafraid because it believed it could not be beaten. The night of the new moon fell with an absolute ink-black finality. The surrounding mountains dissolved into nothingness, and the Thorn cabin felt like the last solid place in an empty cosmos. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating, heavy with the smell of tallow, salt, and human dread. Blackwood, dressed in his severe black coat, seemed to draw power from the oppressive atmosphere. He moved with a chilling purpose, using a piece of charcoal to draw a large, perfect circle on the newly scrubbed floor. He then had Jebediah pour a thick, unbroken ring of salt over the line. He placed the twin girls in the center of the circle. They did not resist. They sat down, their legs crossed in an identical fashion, and looked up at their parents with those unnervingly calm blue eyes. The candlelight flickered across their faces, and for a moment, in that wavering light, they looked so small, so innocent, that a visible tremor ran through Martha. She took a half-step back. A strangled sob caught in her throat. Blackwood's hand fell upon her shoulder, his grip as hard and unyielding as iron. "Remember who they are," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper in her ear. "Remember who you are fighting for. Your daughters are trapped within that vessel. Do not fail them now." He handed a silvered mirror to Jebediah and another to Martha, positioning them on opposite sides of the circle. "You are the pillars of this temple," he instructed. "You will hold these mirrors and reflect the Lord's light upon them. The demon will see its own foulness from both sides and will have nowhere to hide. Do not look away. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you must not look away." Jebediah's arms trembled as he raised the heavy mirror. He stared at the reflection of his daughters, his own haggard face looming behind them like a ghost. Martha did the same, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The girls sat perfectly still between them and cast a single, stark shadow on the floorboards, a dark pool of ink that seemed to drink the candlelight. The ritual began. Blackwood started to chant, his voice low and guttural, a litany of ancient-sounding names and condemnations that echoed strangely in the small, sealed room. The words were a rhythmic, hypnotic drone that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He paced slowly around the outside of the salt circle, holding his worn Bible aloft like a weapon. He commanded the parents to repeat phrases after him. "Abomination of the flesh, we cast thee out," he would roar, and two broken, trembling voices would echo him. "Yea, cast thee out." "Spirit of the unholy union, we sever thy bond," he declared, and they would repeat, "Sever thy bond." Alara and Lyra remained silent, their heads turning in perfect unison to follow the preacher's movements. There was no fear in their eyes, only a deep, ancient, and unnerving curiosity. They watched the ritual as if it were a strange play being performed for their amusement, and this horrifying lack of reaction only fueled the fervor of the adults. They were not witnessing the terror of children. They were witnessing the arrogance of a demon. The preacher's chanting grew louder, faster, his voice rising in a feverish crescendo. He took the braided horsehair rope and held it taut above the girls' heads. "With this worldly tether, I bind your worldly claim," he shouted. Then, producing a long, wicked-looking knife from his coat, he declared, "And with this consecrated steel, I sever your unholy connection. Be ye separated. Be ye undone." He sliced the rope in two with a single, violent motion. It was then that reality buckled. The instant the rope was cut, a profound and unnatural cold flooded the cabin, a cold so deep it felt as if it emanated from the center of the earth. The dozen candles that had been burning steadily did not flicker or sputter out. They were extinguished, all of them, in the same instant. The room was plunged into a darkness more absolute than any night, a thick, velvety blackness that felt solid, pressing in on them from all sides. All sound ceased. The wind outside, the creak of the cabin walls, even the sound of their own frantic breathing. It all vanished. The silence that remained was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was a deafening, crushing void. A low hum began to fill the non-sound, a vibration that seemed to resonate not in their ears, but in the bones of their skulls. A pressure built in the room, making their teeth ache and their chests feel tight. And in the center of the circle, where the girls had been sitting, a single point of light appeared. Not a warm, yellow light, but a cold, blue-white pinprick that pulsed with a sickening, alien rhythm. It expanded rapidly, not casting light on the room, but seeming to consume the darkness around it, growing into a silent, blinding flash that bleached all vision. Jebediah and Martha cried out, dropping the mirrors, which shattered on the floor. They threw their hands over their eyes, but the light was so intense it burned straight through their eyelids. They felt a powerful, rushing wind tear through the cabin, though the doors and window were sealed. It was a gale of pure force that smelled of ozone and cold, damp earth. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The pressure vanished, the humming stopped, the light was gone. The silence that returned was different. It was an empty, hollow silence, a grave-like stillness. One by one, the candles on the mantel began to reignite, not with a spark, but with a slow, ghostly bloom, as if their wicks were remembering the fire they once held. The pale, trembling light spread through the cabin, revealing the scene of devastation. Reverend Blackwood was on his knees just outside the salt circle, his face ashen, his body shaking, a look of ecstatic terror on his features. Jebediah and Martha were huddled against the far wall, clinging to each other. The salt circle was undisturbed, but it was empty. Alara and Lyra were gone, vanished completely. There was no trace they had ever been there, except for one. In the very center of the circle, where the girl's single shadow had lain, was the burn. It was a perfect silhouette of a small child, seared deep into the wooden floorboards. It was not a scorch mark left by fire. It was a stain of pure, absolute black, a patch of darkness so profound it seemed to have depth, as if a hole had been torn through the floor into a place where no light could ever exist. The ritual was complete. The union had been cast out, but it had taken the bodies of Alara and Lyra with it, leaving only its shadow behind, a permanent scar on the heart of the thorn cabin. For a long time after the candles relit themselves, no one moved. The three of them remained frozen in their tableau of blasphemy. Blackwood on his knees, a triumphant gargoyle. Martha and Jebediah, a single, trembling form, huddled against the rough-hewn wall. The only thing in the room with any sense of permanence was the shadow. It was a patch of absolute night, a wound in the world that would not close. It was Jebediah who finally broke the silence, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "They're gone." It was not a question. It was the flat, toneless statement of a man who has just witnessed the end of his world. Reverend Blackwood staggered to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes held the terrifying, incandescent glow of the truly certain. "Gone from this world of flesh, yes," he corrected, his voice shaking with a mixture of shock and elation. "The beast has been cast out, Jebediah. It has fled back to the pit from which it came, but in its final, spiteful act it consumed the physical vessels it inhabited." He strode over to the salt circle, his boots crunching on the shattered pieces of the mirrors. He looked down at the burned silhouette. "This," he declared, his voice ringing with a terrible authority, "is its scar, the brand of its defeat. Your daughters, your true daughters, their souls are now with God. They are free." He was rebuilding their reality even as the old one lay in smoldering ruins. He was giving them a narrative to cling to, a holy justification for the empty space where their children used to be. Martha, her mind shattered by the ordeal, began to laugh, a high, thin, unhinged sound that was far more terrifying than any scream. She was clinging to the preacher's words, to the idea that she was a savior, not a monster. Jebediah, however, was not so easily swayed. He looked from the preacher's wild-eyed face to the black stain on his floor and felt a cold, hard certainty settle in his gut. This was not a victory. This was not salvation. This was an execution. He had traded his daughters for a ghost story and a permanent stain. But what was done was done. Blackwood, ever the pragmatist, beneath the fanaticism, quickly turned to the worldly consequences. "No one can know the truth of what happened here tonight," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "They would not understand the necessity. They would call this work of God a work of murder." He began to pace, his mind already spinning the web of their deceit. "There was a struggle," he began, laying out the story piece by piece. "Vagrants, drifters passing through. They came to the door seeking food, and you offered it. They saw the girls and saw an opportunity. You fought, Jebediah. You fought with all your might. The lantern was knocked over. That is what caused the burn on the floor. But they overpowered you. They took the girls and fled into the night. He made them rehearse it, drilling the story into their exhausted minds like a catechism. He made Jebediah strike his own face, leaving a bruise that would corroborate the tale of a fight. He had Martha tear her dress at the collar. He tidied the cabin, scattering a few items to suggest a struggle, kicking the last remaining shards of the mirrors under the hearth. He was an artist of deception, and the thorns were his unwilling, broken clay. The next morning, it was Jebediah who made the slow, heavy-footed walk to the nearest neighbor to raise the alarm. His performance was chillingly convincing, his grief and shock so palpable because they were utterly real, merely redirected from an unspeakable truth to a plausible lie. When Sheriff Brody Hayes arrived, he found a scene that matched the story he'd been told. He saw a bruised and hollow-eyed man, a wife who seemed to have retreated into a world behind her own eyes, and a cabin that felt thick with trauma. He was a practical man, and the story of a kidnapping, while tragic, was simple and required no leaps of faith. He noted the strange scorch mark on the floor. "Looks like a child's silhouette," he observed, rubbing his chin. "Oddest burn I've ever seen." "The lantern fell right there," Jebediah mumbled, the lie feeling like ash in his mouth. It burned out quick." The sheriff, overworked and with a vast, untamable territory to patrol, saw no evidence to contradict the story. There were no other footprints, no witnesses, nothing but the word of two grieving parents and a visiting preacher who solemnly corroborated their account. He organized a search party, a futile gesture against the immensity of the wilderness. They found nothing. After a week, the search was called off. The official report was filed. The case of the missing Thorne twins was closed. The day after the sheriff's final visit, Reverend Silas Blackwood departed. He gave the Thornes a final, chilling blessing, assuring them that their sacrifice had earned them a place in heaven. And then he walked away, disappearing back into the winding trails and deep shadows of the mountains, leaving Jebediah and Martha utterly alone with the consequences of their faith. The silence that descended upon the cabin in the following weeks was a living thing. It was the silence of absence, a quiet so profound it was a constant, screaming reminder of the two small voices that were no longer there. Jebediah and Martha moved through their days like ghosts in their own home, the shared trauma a wall of glass between them. They did not speak of the ritual. They did not speak of the girls. They barely spoke at all, but their shared guilt was a poison that contaminated every breath they took. And at the center of their silent world was the shadow on the floor. It was a constant, unblinking accusation. Jebediah tried to remove it. In a fit of rage and despair, he took a bucket of lye and a hard, bristled brush and scrubbed at the stain until his knuckles were raw and bleeding. The lye bleached the wood around it to a ghostly white, but the shadow itself remained untouched, a patch of inviolable black. He took his woodworking plane to it next, intending to shave the stain away, layer by layer, but the wood he peeled up was as black as the surface. The stain did not lie upon the wood. It was the wood. It went all the way through. It was Martha who first noticed its subtle wrongness. A week after Blackwood left, she was sitting at the table, staring vacantly at the floor, her mind a fog of grief. She knew the shadow's shape by heart, the slight tilt of the head, the arms faintly outstretched. She blinked, and for a fleeting second, she could have sworn one of the arms was bent slightly at the elbow, as if waving. She closed her eyes, shaking her head, attributing it to a trick of the light, to a mind unraveling from sorrow. But a few days later, it happened again. Jebediah had gone out to check his traps, and Martha was alone. She glanced at the shadow, and this time the change was undeniable. The silhouette's head was tilted in the opposite direction. A cold dread, colder than anything she had felt during the ritual, began to creep up her spine. It was not a memory, it was not a stain, it was watching her. The haunting did not begin with a roar, but with a whisper. At night, as they lay side by side in their bed, a chasm of silence between them, they would hear it. A faint, dry skittering sound from the center of the room, like small, smooth stones being moved across floorboards. It was the sound of the game their daughters used to play. Jebediah would lie rigid, his eyes wide open in the darkness, pretending to be asleep. Martha would pull the thin blanket up to her chin, her body trembling uncontrollably. Neither of them ever acknowledged the sound to the other. To speak of it would be to admit that the ritual had not been an exorcism, but a conjuring, that they had not banished a demon, but had murdered their children, and in doing so, had created something far, far worse. The shadow began to grow bolder. It was no longer content to simply change its shape when unobserved. It began to interact with the light. One evening, as Martha lit the single lantern on the mantel, her own shadow was cast long and thin against the opposite wall. As she turned back to the room, she saw with a gasp that the burned shadow on the floor was no longer there. For a terrifying moment, she thought it had vanished. Then she looked back at her own shadow on the wall. It was distorted. It was taller, impossibly thin, and from its side, a second, smaller silhouette was attached, a child-sized shape clinging to her own. She stumbled back, crying out, and as she moved out of the lantern's direct light, her shadow on the wall returned to normal. She risked a glance at the floor. The burned shadow was back in its place, inert and still. It was a parasite, a thing of pure malevolence that could detach itself from the floor and anchor itself to their own shadows, a vengeful echo clinging to its creators. Jebediah experienced it too. He would be sitting by the fire, and in the flickering light, his shadow cast on the wall behind him would suddenly sprout a second head, a perfect, small replica of the first, which would turn and watch him. He would leap to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs, and the shadow would snap back to its normal shape. He was a stoic, rational man, but this silent, creeping violation of the laws of nature was beginning to fray the edges of his sanity. He felt as if he was being stalked by a memory, hunted by an absence. The cabin, their only refuge from the harshness of the world, became their prison. They felt a constant, oppressive sense of being watched, not just by the stain on the floor, but by the very air itself. The temperature in the cabin was always cold, a deep, cellar-like chill that no fire could fully banish. Objects began to move. A tin cup would be on the table when they went to bed, and on the floor in the morning. A small, smooth stone, one of the girls' old playthings, appeared on Jebediah's pillow. The haunting was becoming more personal, more intimate. The entity was learning. It was moving from simple mimicry to calculated psychological torment, using their own memories as a weapon against them. Martha began to break. She started talking to the shadow, her voice a soft, cooing whisper. Sometimes she would scold it, as if it were a misbehaving child. Other times, she would leave a small plate of food beside it, a pathetic offering that would remain untouched. Jebediah watched her descent into madness with a growing horror, for he saw in her a reflection of his own unraveling mind. The entity was not just haunting their cabin, it was haunting their sanity. It was a slow, methodical, and inescapable revenge enacted by the very thing they had created. A shadow with a memory, a silence with a voice, and it was just beginning. The winter that followed was a season of profound and absolute isolation. Snow buried Thorn Hollow under a thick, white shroud, cutting the cabin off from the world and sealing Jebediah and Martha inside with their spectral tormentor. The entity, now seemingly powered by their terror, grew more audacious. It no longer waited for the cloak of night. In the flat, gray light of a winter afternoon, Jebediah would see the shadow on the floor stretch and contort, its limbs elongating into impossible, spider-like shapes, its silhouette twisting in a silent, mocking ballet. Martha's one-sided conversations with the stain grew more frequent, more frantic. She would sit before it for hours, pleading with it, begging for forgiveness, trying to coax the spirits of her daughters out of the blackness. Jebediah watched, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest, knowing that she was not speaking to the ghost of their children, but whispering secrets to the architect of their damnation. The end for Martha came not with a scream, but with a quiet, terrible acceptance. One morning, Jebediah awoke to find her side of the bed empty and cold. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, and he knew she could not have gone far. A dreadful premonition guided him from the bed. He found her in the center of the cabin. She was lying on the floor, curled in a fetal position, directly on top of the burned shadow, her body perfectly aligned with the silhouette beneath her. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with a look of serene emptiness. There was no sign of struggle, no mark on her body. But as the weak morning light filtered into the room, Jebediah saw the true horror. Martha, lying in a patch of sunlight, cast no shadow of her own. It was as if the thing on the floor had reached up and simply taken it, siphoned it away, and her life with it. He did not move her. He could not bring himself to touch her. He simply closed the cabin door, went out into the blinding white of the snow, and began to chop wood with a frenzied, desperate energy. The rhythmic thud of his axe, a lonely, percussive scream against the suffocating silence. Jebediah lasted another month alone. His sanity, already hanging by a thread, snapped. He was a man besieged by an enemy he could not fight, could not reason with, could not even see in its true form. He was haunted by the skittering sounds in the night, by the sight of his own shadow twisting into monstrous shapes on the wall, by the silent, accusing presence of his wife's body, which he had left untouched on the floor. His final act was one of desperate flight. The nearest neighbor, a farmer named Silas Croft, was awoken in the middle of the night by the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. He looked toward Thorn Hollow and saw the single lantern in their window flicker violently and then go out, plunging the valley into darkness. The next morning, concerned, he made the trek up the mountain. He found the cabin door swinging open. Inside, a scene of chaos. Every source of light was destroyed. The lantern was shattered on the floor. The few remaining candles were snapped in two. The fireplace was choked with dirt. Martha's body was still on the floor, untouched. But Jebediah was gone. They found him a day later, at the bottom of a small, rocky ravine a half-mile from the cabin. The official cause of death was exposure, a simple and believable tragedy. But Sheriff Hayes, standing over the body as the morning sun cast long shadows from the trees, noted something that made the hair on his arms stand up. Jebediah Thorne, lying there in the crisp, clear light of day, had no shadow. His body lay upon the snow, but the space around him was pristine, unbroken white. It was a physical impossibility, a violation of the world as he knew it. He kept this detail to himself, writing it off as a trick of the light, a symptom of his own unease. The Thorne cabin was abandoned, left to the wind and the rot. It quickly became a place of dark local legend, a shunned and haunted hollow where a family had simply been erased by the mountains, leaving behind nothing but a strange, child-shaped stain on the floor that the old folks warned would steal your shadow if you looked at it for too long. Years passed. The memory of the Thorne family faded into folklore. But the vengeful echo born in that cabin was not bound by geography. Its justice was not yet complete. Miles away, in a different state, Reverend Silas Blackwood had thrived. He had used the story of his triumph over the Thorn Hollow Union as a cornerstone of his reputation, a dark and thrilling sermon that held congregations in rapt attention. He spoke of it vaguely, never with names or locations, but as a testament to his power, his unique insight into the devil's machinations. He was respected, feared, and his collection plate was always full. He had put the true events of that night out of his mind, burying them under a mountain of self-righteousness. He had convinced himself that he was a hero. The haunting began for him just as it had for the Thornes, subtly. It started with a flicker in his own shadow. He would be in his study, reading his Bible by lamplight, and his silhouette on the wall would seem to shiver, to momentarily ripple as if it were a reflection in disturbed water. He dismissed it as eye strain, as a flaw in the lamp's glass. Then he began to feel it, a persistent, creeping cold in rooms that were otherwise warm. The unnerving sensation of being watched when he was completely alone. He would turn suddenly, expecting to see someone only to find an empty room. But the feeling would linger, a cold spot in the air, a psychic pressure that raised the goose flesh on his arms. His arrogance was his shield. He recognized the signs of a spiritual attack, but he believed it was a test from the devil, a consequence of his great and holy work. He redoubled his prayers. He fasted. He performed rites of cleansing on his own home. He tried to fight it with the same tools he had used to destroy the thorns. But this was different. This entity was not some abstract evil he could define with scripture. This was a targeted presence. It knew him. One night, he awoke in a cold sweat, the sound of small, smooth stones skittering across wood echoing in his mind. He sat bolt upright in bed, his heart hammering, and knew with a sudden, soul-crushing certainty that the thing he had created had followed him. His descent began in earnest. The changes to his shadow became more pronounced. It was no longer just a flicker. He would be walking down the street, and in his peripheral vision, he would see his own shadow sprout a second, smaller head. He would whip his head around, and it would be normal again. The entity was toying with him, using the same tactics it had used on Jebediah, but this time with a more refined cruelty. Blackwood, a man who had built his life on the power of light and shadow, became terrified of his own silhouette. He began to avoid well-lit places, preferring the dim gloom of evening, the safety of a moonless night. His congregation noticed the change. Their once commanding preacher had become a furtive, haunted man, his eyes constantly darting to the shadows in the corners of the church. The final, most terrifying stage of the haunting began when he noticed his shadow was shrinking. It was a slow, almost imperceptible process. At first, he thought he was imagining it, but he began to measure it obsessively. He would stand in the same spot in his study at noon each day, marking the top of his shadow's head on the floor with a piece of chalk. Each day, the new mark was a fraction of an inch lower than the last. The shadow, the very proof of his existence in the light, was being consumed. It was being eaten away, drawn back into his body by the parasitic entity that now clung to his soul. Panic gave way to a profound, existential terror. The entity was not just haunting him, it was erasing him. It was a cold, methodical, and patient revenge, the perfect retribution for a crime that had left nothing behind but a shadow. Nearly a century later, in the year 2011, a doctoral student named Alistair Finch was working in the archives of a defunct theological college, researching the itinerant preacher movement of the early 20th century. He came across a small, unassuming crate of effects belonging to a long-dead minister named Silas Blackwood. Inside, among yellowed sermon notes and faded correspondence, was a heavy, leather-bound King James Bible. It felt strangely light for its size. Finch ran his thumb along the gilded edges of the pages and felt a subtle ridge. Prying it open, he found that the back half of the book had been hollowed out, creating a secret compartment. And inside that compartment was a small, leather-bound diary, its pages filled with a cramped, spidery script. Most of the entries were what he expected: self-aggrandizing accounts of sermons, condemnations of sinners, and pious reflections. But it was the entries from the autumn of 1911, and then a series of frantic, terrified entries from several years later, that made the young historian's blood run cold. He was holding the lost document, the final confession. The truth of the Shadowless twins. An early entry read, October 12, 1911. The Lord's work is done in the place they call Thorn Hollow. I have faced the beast, a singular abomination wearing the flesh of two. The ritual of separation was a terrible success. The entity was cast back into the pit, though it consumed the children's bodies in its flight. The parents, though weak, held fast. They are saved. I have left them with a story to protect them from the inquiries of lesser men. A scar remains on the floor, a testament to God's victory through my hands. But it was the final entries, written in a shaky, disintegrating hand, that told the true story of the aftermath. November 4th, 1917. The affliction has followed me. For months, I have been besieged. My own shadow betrays me, twisting into the shape of a child. I rebuke it in the name of the Lord, but it does not flee. The cold has seeped into my bones. I hear the stones, the sound of their infernal game. It has found me, January 9th, 1918. My shadow recedes. It shrinks daily. I measure it. I am a man of God, yet I feel my soul being devoured by this echo. The thing in the cabin was not a demon in the way I understood. It was a union, yes, but of what? I believed I was performing an exorcism. I now believe I committed a murder so profound it gave birth to a ghost made of vengeance itself. It is not the girls who haunt me. It is the silence they left behind. The final, nearly illegible entry was scrawled across the page, the pen having dug into the paper with desperate force. February 2nd, 1918. It is almost gone. My shadow. It is but a stump at my feet, even in the midday sun. I have not left this room in a week. I have shattered the lamps. I live in the dark, but it makes no difference. The cold is inside me now. I know what it wants. It wants the debt paid, the last piece of the soul it was denied. I can feel it detaching. It is no longer on the floor. It is in the room. A shape made of perfect darkness is rising from the corner. Oh God, my God. It has no shadow of its own. There were no further entries. The diary solved the mystery of the Thorn Cabin and the ultimate fate of Reverend Blackwood. The echo had claimed its final victim, and its long revenge was complete. This leads us to the dark, moral heart of this story. Who was truly responsible for the tragedy in Thorn Hollow? Was it Reverend Blackwood, who weaponized their faith? Was it Jebediah and Martha, who allowed their fear to curdle into a horrific resolve? Or was it the community itself, whose shunning and superstition created the fertile ground for such a tragedy to grow? Share your verdict in the comments below. History is not a collection of settled facts, but a landscape of buried secrets. Some truths are hidden by design, locked away in archives and forgotten diaries. Others are hidden by their very nature, events so far outside our understanding that they are dismissed as folklore or delusion. The case of the Shadowless twins is a chilling reminder that the darkest parts of our history are not always the wars or the famines, but the small, quiet atrocities committed in isolated rooms born of fear and fanaticism. They are the stories that leave behind no bodies, no evidence, only a scar on the world, and an echo that waits patiently in the silence for justice. Thank you for walking with us into the shadows of Thorn Hollow. The past is full of these silent screams, waiting in archives and in folklore. We are here to listen. To ensure you don't miss our next descent into the dark, subscribe to the channel and like this video to help us reach others who need to hear these stories. Until next time, listen to the silence.